All right, so today we're diving into something pretty peculiar. It's Vienna's Narrenturm.
Ah, yeah, the Fool's Tower, as the locals call it.
Right, right. Fool's Tower. And even back when it was built in the 1780s, people already had this sense that, well, something was off.
Yeah, it's definitely not your typical building.
No, no, not at all. And, on the surface, it seems simple enough, right? Emperor Joseph II, who was all about reason and progress, he commissions this five-story cylindrical building to be like a modern insane asylum.
A forward-thinking idea for sure.
Yeah. But then you look at it and, well, it even got nicknamed the Google-Hoof.
Gulhupf, like a bunt cake.
Exactly, because of its shape. I mean, who designs an asylum as a giant cylinder?
It's a good question. And that's just the beginning. I mean, think about it. Why would you build an asylum like that when you could have a more practical, rectangular layout?
And then there are the thick walls, like way thicker than they needed to be. And then there's this whole network of tubes running through them, plus that strained octagonal room at the top.
Which, by the way, only the emperor could get to.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting, because the source material we're looking at today, it suggests that this Narrenturm might have been a lot more than just a place to keep people who are, mentally ill.
It makes a very compelling argument that for an insane asylum in the 18th century, this design, the way they ran things, it makes absolutely no sense.
Okay, so let's talk about that. What doesn't make sense? What are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, the Narrenturm was way too small for the number of patients they supposedly wanted to put in there.
Ah, so it wasn't really practical.
Not at all. And then there's the expense. Remember, Emperor Joseph II, this was a guy who was all about being pragmatic, but he poured a ton of money into this really elaborate building. Why? When there are simpler, cheaper options out there.
So if it wasn't really about practicality or taking care of patients, what was its purpose?
Well, the treatise we're diving into today, it proposes that the Narrenturm might have actually been a cosmic machine.
A cosmic machine. Okay, you got to break that down for me.
But
What's a cosmic machine?
imagine a structure built by humans, but designed to work with unseen energies. Manipulate forces we can't really see.
Oh, okay, so like think pyramids, Stonehenge, that sort of thing.
Exactly. The treatise even points to Gothic cathedrals. It argues that these kinds of structures have existed for centuries all over the world.
So we're talking about like geometric principles, numerical patterns, maybe even aligning the building with the stars, all to tap into something bigger.
You got it. And don't forget, this was the 18th century. Back then, the lines between esoteric thought and what we'd now call science, they were pretty blurry. Think Benjamin Franklin.
Ah, yeah, with his electricity experiments and all that. In that context, I guess cosmic machine doesn't sound as out there. But, okay, let's get back to the Narrenturm. What evidence is there to support this cosmic machine idea?
The treatise points to a lot of specific architectural features and how the building was run. We could start with the octagon, that room at the top.
The one only the emperor could access. Yeah, what's the deal with that?
Well, just think about it. Its placement at the very top, that unique shape, and the fact that access was so restricted. It all points to this idea that whatever was going on in there, well, it was meant to be kept secret. And then you've got those metal rods sticking up from the roof.
Right, right. In the treatise, it did mention those rods. Were they just lightning rods? Or could there be more to it?
The treatise actually speculates they might have been used for experiments with, you guessed it, electricity. Maybe even trying to, and this is where it gets wild, contact extraterrestrial beings.
Whoa. Okay, contacting aliens. That's a big claim. But, I mean, we know they were messing around with electricity back then, right?
Right. People were just starting to understand what electricity could do. The treatise also connects the octagon with something called geomancy.
Geomancy. Refresh my memory on that one.
It's the idea that there are invisible energy flows within the earth and you can learn to sense and use them. The idea is that they didn't just plop the octagon down anywhere. They placed it very specifically to make the most of these energies, which, kind of ties into another weird thing about the Narrenturm.
You mean the crazy thick walls and all those tubes?
Exactly. Those walls, they're way more massive than they need to be just to hold the building up. The treatise suggests that it was all about creating some kind of resonance, to amplify these unseen energies, or maybe focus them.
Huh. Interesting. And the official explanation for the tubes was?
A heating system. But honestly, it doesn't quite add up, especially because the Narrenturm didn't even have fireplaces originally.
And on top of that, none of those tubes carried water, right? Which brings us to another odd thing. The complete lack of running water in the whole building.
Yeah. You'd think a building designed for, care and hygiene would have running water even back then. But the treatise argues that maybe, just maybe, running water would have messed with whatever they were doing with this cosmic machine.
So they deliberately left it out to keep the energy flowing.
It's a pretty wild idea, right? But then it gets even wilder when you consider how they arranged the patients inside.
You mean the fact that patients were on different floors depending on how severe their illness was?
Exactly. The harmless ones were down on the lower floors. But as you went higher, the severity increased, culminating with the most severely ill patients right below the octagon.
Almost like they were part of the experiment.
The treatise suggests exactly that. It speculates that they might have been using the patient's different conditions to try and measure, the strength of the energies or what effect they were having.
Wow. It's a little creepy, honestly. Especially since there were also military lunatics mixed in there, too.
That's a really intriguing detail.
Right.
You have soldiers who would have been important assets stuck in a civilian institution for the mentally ill. What were they doing there? Were they part of the experiment, too?
Okay, so we've got a building with features that make zero sense for an asylum. It's hinting at something way more esoteric. But before we get too carried away here, let's talk about the guy who was behind all of this, Emperor Joseph II. What would make an emperor create a cosmic machine? I mean, what were his motives?
It's a question that's puzzled historians for a long time. On the surface, Joseph II was all about logic, the Enlightenment and all that, progress, reform. But he'd also gone through some tough stuff personally. He lost family members, and he had a chronic illness.
So maybe it wasn't just intellectual curiosity. Maybe there's a personal element to this.
The treatise explores that idea. Was he trying to use these cosmic energies to heal himself? Or was there something even deeper going on, something more occult?
This is getting really interesting. Let's dig into those motives, plus some other aspects of the Narrenturm. What do you think about?
It really is a fascinating thought, isn't it? This idea that a ruler, an emperor, might have been trying to tap into something beyond, our everyday world, to heal himself. And it all happened right there in that octagonal room above the patients.
Yeah, the treatise does suggest that the octagon might have been like a meditation chamber of sorts. A place where he could really focus his intentions, maybe try to direct those energies inward.
And remember how we talked about the patients being arranged by the severity of their illness, with the most severe cases right below the octagon.
It almost makes you wonder, was he drawing on their energy? That seems a little, I don't know, ethically questionable, doesn't it?
We have to remember that our understanding of energy, and mental illness for that matter, was completely different back then.
True, true. So maybe in the 18th century, this arrangement wasn't seen as like exploitation. Maybe it was more of a reciprocal kind of thing. He draws on their energy to help himself, and maybe, in turn, he influences their conditions.
That's one of the possibilities the treatise explores. And there are actually accounts of patients, after the emperor visited, having, shifts in their mental states. Sometimes for the better, sometimes not.
Almost like some kind of energy feedback loop between the emperor and the patients.
Exactly. It's a weird concept for sure. But, okay, let's say, for the sake of argument, that Joseph II really was trying to use this cosmic machine to heal himself. Then why all the secrecy? Why not be open about it?
Right. If it was all about healing, why not just tell everyone?
Well, remember, we're talking about the 1780s. The church still had a ton of power, and anything that even hinted at, like the occult, it was a huge deal. It could have been seen as heresy, a real threat to the emperor's authority, even his soul.
So in public, he has to be all about reason and piety, but in private, he's exploring these other, more unconventional things. It makes you wonder, though, was he the only one doing this kind of stuff?
There's evidence suggesting that Joseph II wasn't the only ruler at the time who, well, a bit interested in the occult, shall we say. Lots of them were involved in secret societies and things like that, poking around the edges of what was considered acceptable knowledge.
So maybe the Narrenturm wasn't totally unique. Maybe other courts were doing similar things, just on a smaller scale.
It's possible.
Yeah.
And it raises another question. Were they sharing information? Was there a whole network of rulers all experimenting with this stuff?
A secret society of, cosmic monarchs. Okay, that's a thought that I kind of love.
It just shows you how important historical context is, right? You can't just look at something in isolation. You have to consider what else was going on, what people were thinking and believing at the time.
You're absolutely right. The Narrenturm wasn't just a building. It was part of a whole world of ideas, fears, and hopes. It reflects the anxieties of the time,
Oh.
but also the aspirations, and maybe even the desperation of a ruler who's dealing with some pretty heavy personal and political stuff.
And that brings us back to Joseph II's motives. I mean, was this all about self-preservation? Was he just desperate to stay alive and hold on to power? Or was there something more idealistic driving him?
Well, the treatise suggests that Joseph II really did believe that he was doing what was best for his people. He saw himself as this enlightened leader, using every tool at his disposal to, improve their lives.
Even if those tools were a little out there, potentially risky even.
Exactly. Which brings us back to those military lunatics we talked about. Why were they there? I mean, what was the point of housing soldiers, who you'd think would be pretty valuable, in an asylum?
That's a detail a lot of people overlook, but it's really important. The treatise proposes that maybe their presence was part of some bigger experiment. Maybe exploring how these cosmic energies could affect, like, human behavior or even enhance people's mental and physical abilities.
So instead of a healing machine for himself, maybe the Narrenturm was supposed to be like a prototype for creating super soldiers powered by cosmic energy or something. That sounds straight out of a comic book.
Haha, it does, doesn't it? But we have to remember, back then, the boundaries between science and imagination were pretty fluid.
Okay, I'll give you that. But even if Joseph II did have such a, well, ambitious vision, did he really have any way to pull it off? Was the technology even there to do that kind of stuff?
That's where the treatise gets a little more speculative. It draws on ideas from esoteric traditions and points to structures like the pyramids and Stonehenge, those places that people believe have these special energetic properties.
So maybe they were looking to the past for answers,
Yeah.
trying to rediscover the lost knowledge of ancient civilizations or something.
Exactly. In the 18th century, there was this renewed fascination with ancient wisdom, especially with discoveries like Pompeii and the Rosetta Stone happening.
So we're not just talking about Enlightenment thinking here. We're talking about a kind of neo-ancient experiment, trying to bridge the gap between the modern world and the mysteries of the past.
You've got it. It really shows you how complex Joseph II's vision was. He wasn't just trying to build a better future. He was also trying to, reclaim something that had been lost, some connection to a more primal kind of power.
So what we're seeing here is a ruler who was driven by all these different things, right? Personal ambition, this desire to heal himself and his people, and maybe even this yearning for something beyond normal science.
And don't forget, we're just scratching the surface here. The Narrenturm is like an onion. So many layers to uncover, so many mysteries.
With every layer we peel back, it seems like even more questions pop up. But maybe that's the point, right? Maybe the Narrenturm wasn't meant to be completely understood. Maybe it was meant to inspire wonder, curiosity, and, maybe even a bit of healthy skepticism.
I like that. It reminds us that history isn't just about knowing the facts. It's about understanding people's experiences, their beliefs, their imaginations. It's all connected.
And some of the most interesting stories are the ones that leave you with more questions than answers. But as we keep exploring the mysteries of the Narrenturm, one big question remains. What happened to this so-called cosmic machine? Why did they seemingly just abandon it? And what happened to all those patients living inside?
Yeah, it makes you wonder what happened to this whole project and, the people who were involved in it.
The treatise doesn't say much about what happened to the patients, unfortunately. But there is some interesting stuff about what happened to some of the people who worked there, especially this one guy, Joseph Quarren.
Oh, right, Quarren. He was the emperor's physician, right?
Yeah.
The one who was in charge of the Narrenturm. So what happened to him?
Well, this is where things get a bit strange. So Joseph II dies, right? And then, almost immediately, Quarren resigns from his job at the General Hospital.
That's weird. I mean, he was at the top of his game, right? Why would he just quit like that?
Exactly. And it gets even weirder. So the new emperor, Leopold II, he gives Quarren a title, makes him a baron, and then, on top of that, he gives him a huge amount of money. Wait, so they give him a title and a ton of cash. That's a pretty sweet goodbye present.
Right. So the treatise, it suggests that maybe this wasn't just a reward for his service. Maybe it was more like a way to make sure he kept his mouth shut, to guarantee his loyalty and make sure he didn't spill any secrets about what was really going on at the Narrenturm.
So basically, they thought Quarren knew too much, and they wanted to make sure he took those secrets to the grave.
It's definitely a possibility. It shows you how sensitive this whole thing with the occult was, right? What might have been okay under one ruler could get you in big trouble under another.
Okay, so Quarren's out of the picture, and the Narrenturm's no longer this cosmic machine or whatever. What happened to all the patients?
It's hard to say for sure. The historical records aren't great. And the treatise, it focuses more on the building itself, not such the people who live there.
But the Narrenturm stayed opened, right? It kept being used as an asylum.
Right. But with the emperor out of the picture and Quarren gone, it seems like the whole, esoteric experiment thing was dropped. They went back to more traditional ways of treating mental illness.
Which, based on some of the stuff we've read, probably wasn't much better for the patients.
Yeah, it's a tough thing to think about, and it brings up some serious ethical questions. Even if Joseph II had good intentions, even if he thought this cosmic machine could really help people, was it worth the potential suffering that those patients might have gone through?
That's a tough question, for sure. And it shows just how complicated it can be to look back at history, especially when you're dealing with things that mix science and ethics and belief.
Totally. I mean, we can't just judge people in the past based on what we think is right today. We have to try to understand their world, their motivations, the limits of what they knew back then.
But at the same time, we can't just ignore the fact that harm might have been done, even if it wasn't intentional.
Right, it's important to acknowledge that, and by doing that, we can learn from history and, hopefully create a better, more just world today.
Well said. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Narrenturm, honestly, I think I'm just kind of in awe. I mean, Joseph II's vision was so ambitious, and he was willing to push boundaries, to try things that no one else would even think of. But at the same time, there's a part of me that feels sad for the people who got caught up in this whole grand, but also, pretty messed up experiment.
I feel that too, but I also think there's a sense of wonder here. Like the universe is so vast and there's so many things we still don't understand. And the lengths that humans will go to try and unlock those secrets, it's pretty amazing.
The Narrenturm might be gone,
Yeah.
and the secrets are probably lost to time. But the story of how it came to be, the ambition, the desperation, the hope, that's something that still speaks to us today, I think. It reminds us that humans are capable of such amazing things, both good and bad.
And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from all of this. As we keep exploring the universe, both the one out there and the one inside of us, we have to remember to use our knowledge wisely, with compassion, and with a deep respect for, well, for all life.
That's a really great point. And on that note, we'll leave you to think about the Narrenturm and what it all means. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep. We'll catch you next time.